Daniel LaPlante was an American man who was born on May 15, 1970 in Townsend, Massachusetts. Daniel's childhood was marked by several difficult experiences, including his parents' divorce and his mother's remarriage to an allegedly abusive stepfather. He was also reportedly bullied at school, which made it difficult for him to form meaningful connections with his peers. Daniel is said to have suffered physical abuse from both his biological father and his stepfather throughout his childhood. Daniel went to St. Bernard's High School in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, where students and teachers described him as an introvert and rather unsociable. He didn't fit in whatsoever and was considered a weirdo or even a creep, predominantly due to his strange looks, weird behavior, and bad hygiene. Daniel was also diagnosed with dyslexia early in life, which caused him a lot of trouble academically. A neighbor had grown alarmed by Daniel's frequent solitary trips into the woods behind his house by the 1980s. You'd see him walk out there by himself. That's the only place you would ever see him. The woods, said his neighbor. Daniel's family was in fact looked at as quite odd by the entire neighborhood, because they had stray animals running around everywhere and piles of junk scattered around their residence. However, Daniel's neighbor wasn't the only one concerned with his unusual behavior. He eventually got recommended to a psychiatrist by the faculty at his school. Daniel went along with this recommendation but didn't receive much help at all. He did get diagnosed with hyperactive disorder, although it's alleged that the mental health professional would physically abuse Daniel during their appointments. Eventually, Daniel developed a tendency to break into homes at the young age of 14. He would typically steal items such as food or money, which escalated to guns and other valuable belongings. Daniel LaPlante was known for leaving clear signs of his presence during the burglaries and home invasions he committed. In many cases, he would leave doors or windows unlocked or open, or he would break a window or force a door to gain entry. He would also often leave the homes in disarray, with items scattered everywhere, and even move around their furniture. He would often target homes that appeared unoccupied and would typically enter through a window or unlocked door. If a door was locked, he would use a tool such as a crowbar or screwdriver to force it open. See, Daniel didn't have a lot of success with women and had to find a solution to this problem. Daniel was known to use phone catalogs to randomly select phone numbers and call girls, pretending to be someone else in order to gain their trust and arrange meetings. He used this method to obtain the phone number of Annie Andrews. He told her that he was a tall, blonde, athletic guy, despite being none of these things, and would eventually ask Annie out on a date. Annie was 15 at the time and was excited that she was receiving phone calls from a boy who almost seemed too good to be true. Upon meeting Daniel, she was obviously surprised to find out he looked nothing like the guy he had described himself to be. He was approximately 5'8", had black hair, and didn't look athletic at all. But Annie did go on the date with him nonetheless. You can imagine that she might have felt guilty if she were to reject him face to face. At one point during their date, Annie mentioned the death of her mother, which for whatever strange reason intrigued Daniel and prompted him to bombard her with questions about the death. How badly did she suffer? He asked her. There was obviously not going to be a second date. Annie was unsettled and made it very clear that she did not want to hear from Daniel again. In 1986, Annie and her sister began hearing unexplained sounds such as banging and footsteps coming from within their home, even when they were alone. When they told her father about the strange noises coming from the walls, he assured them that it was due to the old age of the house. Annie's father found it silly and was convinced that they were just being dramatic. But strangely enough, there seemed to never be any noise when their father was home. The knocking persisted for a few evenings before it became so frequent that it woke the girls up. Things in the house started to vanish over time. Things that were arranged on a table one day would end up scattered all over the floor the next. Furniture would be moved from one side of the room to the other. 1987, while Annie and her sister were alone in their front room. The tapping had become so prevalent at this time that it was driving the girls insane on this particular evening, though it appeared that the noises were coming from the basement rather than the walls. The two girls approached the source of the disturbance with caution, armed with a kitchen knife. They were confronted with an alarming sight when they crept down below their house. The message was written in blood red on the basement wall. "I'm in your room. Come find me." The girls immediately called their father, begging him to come home. When their father arrived, he was initially dismissive of their claims, believing that it was simply their childish imagination at play. But as Annie Andrews' father entered her room, the faint sound of shuffling caught his attention. His eyes scanned the darkened space, only to lock onto a figure lurking in the shadows. There was a man in the middle of the room. He had on a wig and was wearing Annie's deceased mother's dress. He was also wielding an axe towards Annie's father. The police arrived shortly afterwards but found no man, almost as if he had disappeared out of thin air. They scoured every inch of the house, and just as they thought he had vanished without a trace, they noticed what appeared to be a tiny crawl space underneath the staircase that was barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. There sat Daniel LaPlante, who had been living in the walls of the family home. He had created a hidden living space within the crawl space, complete with blankets, food wrappers, and even a makeshift toilet. It was a chilling realization for the father to find out that his daughters were right all along. Daniel had been watching the family live their daily life through peepholes in the walls, with them not having a single clue. Daniel had been caught red-handed and was charged with multiple offenses. Daniel had clearly pretended to be Annie's mother's ghost in order to harass them. It is thought that LaPlante intended to disclose himself to the daughters while masquerading as their deceased mother. Daniel, however, was determined too young to serve time in prison, so he was sent off to a juvenile detention facility. Eventually, he was eligible for bail and returned into society shortly after, just to go back to his old ways of breaking into homes. He would eventually steal 2 handguns at his neighbor's house and break into several other homes in the area. On the 1st of December, he would visit the home of the Gustafson family, where 33-year-old Priscilla, her 34-year-old husband Andrew, and their 2 children Abigail and William lived together. Priscilla was pregnant and awaiting to give birth to a 3rd child. She also worked as a school nursery teacher and would dedicate a lot of time to taking care of her 2 children. When Daniel LaPlante arrived at her home, Andrew was still at work and Abigail was in school, meaning Priscilla and her son William were the only 2 people in the house. When Andrew returned back home, he was met with the most harrowing sight of his life. Priscilla was found face down on her bed by Andrew, her pillow stained red from blood splatter. She had been physically assaulted before being shot repeatedly in the head at close range. After calling the police, Andrew Gustafson's 2 children's bodies were found in 2 separate bathtubs. William, age 5, had drowned in the upstairs bathroom, and Abigail, age 8, had drowned in the bathroom downstairs after she came home from school. According to news reports and court records, the police found evidence of forced entry into the home through a basement window. They also found that several rooms in the house had been ransacked, suggesting that the perpetrator had been looking for valuables to steal. The police even found writing on the wall strikingly similar to a previous case involving Daniel LaPlante. He also happened to live nearby and had just gotten out of juvenile detention, leading law enforcement to conclude that he was very likely responsible. When police tried to capture him, they discovered that LaPlante had left the region. A manhunt started right away, and LaPlante was seen as highly dangerous and potentially armed. Daniel's past made it impossible to predict the extent he would take to avoid being discovered. Daniel abducted a woman in her car after breaking into her home in a village near Townsend. The woman managed to flee, but Daniel was discovered by someone who had seen him on a news photo. 48 hours after the search for Daniel started, he was found hidden in a dumpster. Daniel's participation in the murder was confirmed when a hair from Abigail was found on his sock during an inspection. Daniel LaPlante was given 3 life sentences for the murder of the family 1 year later. Daniel is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the murder of Priscilla Gustafson and her family. LaPlante was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison in 1988, and he has remained in prison ever since. He has been incarcerated at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Shirley and has been denied parole multiple times. It's important to remember that behind every crime is a victim and their loved ones who have been impacted in profound and often irreversible ways. In the case of Priscilla Gustafson and her family, they suffered a devastating loss that forever changed their lives. So remember that while it can be easy to focus solely on the perpetrator of a crime, it's equally important to recognize the experiences and struggles of the victims. But nonetheless, thank you for watching this episode of Horror Vaults.